Lisa Martinez stood at her workstation aboard the UES Valiant, peering through her microscope at yet another blood sample. The quiet hum of medical equipment filled the pristine lab as she adjusted the magnification. After 15 years as chief medical officer, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to tune out the constant announcements echoing through the ship's corridors. A soft chime from her computer interrupted her concentration. She glanced at the screen, where a message flashed with unprecedented urgency. Unknown vessels detected near Jupiter's orbit. All medical staff on standby. Lisa quickly saved her work and began preparing her medical bay for potential casualties. She had drilled for first contact scenarios countless times, but this was different. This was real. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The unknown ships had made contact, identifying themselves as the Zarkax, a spacefaring species that claimed to seek peaceful relations with Earth. Lisa watched the initial transmission along with the rest of the crew, studying the tall, gray-skinned beings with their large, multifaceted eyes. When the order came to prepare for the arrival of a Zarkax delegation, Lisa methodically readied her equipment for the required medical screening. The aliens had agreed to basic examinations as a show of good faith, though they insisted on bringing their own medical officer to observe. The first Zarkax to enter her medical bay was their ambassador, Kexti. Lisa maintained her professional demeanor as she conducted the examination, but something about the alien's behavior made her uneasy. Every time she reached for a new instrument, Kexti's secondary eyes would track her movements while the primary ones remained fixed on her face. "Your cardiovascular system appears to be quite different from ours," Lisa commented as she reviewed the scan results. "The multiple heart chambers are fascinating." Kexti chittered something that the translator rendered as agreement, but Lisa noticed the alien's skin had developed a faint purple tinge. She had no way to know if this was normal. The examination continued with 4 more Zarkax officials. Each one displayed the same subtle signs that Lisa's experienced eye caught. Slight muscle tensing when asked certain questions, skin color changes when discussing their homeworld, and an odd reluctance to discuss their species' medical history. Lisa was recording her observations when Commander Peter Walsh entered the medical bay. "Dr. Martinez, what's your assessment of our visitors?" She chose her words carefully. "Medically, they're clear for interaction with humans. No obvious pathogens or biological hazards." She paused, then added, "But something feels off. They're hiding something." Walsh nodded grimly. "Several departments have reported similar concerns. We've sent our findings to Earth Command, but..." The ship's alarm suddenly blared to life. Red emergency lights began flashing throughout the medical bay. Lisa's computer screen filled with incoming casualty reports from Earth's orbital stations. "They're attacking." Walsh's voice barely carried over the chaos. The diplomatic ships were a distraction. Their main fleet was hiding behind Jupiter's moons. Lisa's hands flew over her computer, preparing for incoming wounded. As the first victims arrived, she could see the destruction through the medical bay's viewport. Zarkax warships emerged from jump points near Earth's orbital defenses, their weapons already firing. The deception was complete. While their diplomats had distracted Earth's leaders with talks of peace, the Zarkax had positioned their forces for a perfect first strike. As Lisa worked to save the first wave of casualties, she realized this was only the beginning. Earth was at war, and the enemy had just seized the advantage. The Zarkax attack was devastating in its precision. Earth's orbital defense platforms, pride of human military technology, crumbled under the alien weapons like paper in a fire. From the medical bay of the UES Valiant, Lisa watched helplessly as escape pods streamed from the burning wreckage of nearby stations. Commander Peter Walsh's voice crackled through the ship's comm system. "All hands, prepare for emergency jump to Lunar Base Alpha. We've lost contact with half our orbital fleet. Dr. Martinez, secure your patients for immediate transit." Lisa worked quickly, ensuring each wounded crew member was properly strapped down. Her hands moved steadily despite the chaos around her. The ship shuddered as something exploded nearby. but she didn't even look up from securing an IV line. The Valiant's engines roared to life, pushing them away from Earth's orbit. Through the viewport, Lisa saw 3 Zarkak ships turn to pursue them. Their sleek, predatory forms gleamed in the sunlight as they launched a barrage of plasma torpedoes. Incoming fire. The warning barely finished before impact. The ship lurched violently, throwing supplies across the medical bay. Lisa grabbed a bulkhead to stay upright, watching in horror as one of the stasis pods containing a critically injured patient lost power. More impacts rocked the ship. Smoke began pouring through the ventilation system. Lisa pulled on an emergency breather mask and continued working to save her patient. The ship's artificial gravity flickered, but her movements remained precise and focused. Hull breach on decks 3 through 5. The ship's AI announced calmly. Emergency containment failing. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones immediately. Lisa looked at her 5 remaining patients. The medical bay was still secure, but she could hear the growing sounds of destruction moving closer. She had to make a choice: stay with her patients or evacuate them through the chaos. Without hesitation, she began prepping them for transport. The ship shuddered again as she moved the first anti-grav stretcher toward the door. In the corridor, crew members rushed past her, some helping the wounded, others heading to battle stations. A young engineer stopped to help her. Together, they guided the stretchers toward the nearest escape pod bay. Behind them, another explosion rocked the ship. Lisa heard the horrible sound of twisting metal as part of the hull gave way. "Doctor, we need to move faster," the engineer shouted, but Lisa maintained her steady pace, ensuring none of the medical equipment became disconnected from her patients. They reached the escape pod bay just as Commander Walsh's voice came through again. "All hands abandon ship. I repeat, all hands abandon ship. The Valiant cannot hold together much longer." Lisa secured her patients in an escape pod designed for medical evacuation. As she worked, she could see through the bay's windows that the battle had reached the lunar surface. Flashes of weapons fire lit up the moon's dark side, where Lunar Base Alpha struggled against the invasion. The engineer helped her into the pod and sealed the door. As they launched away from the dying Valiant, Lisa continued monitoring her patients' vital signs. Their pod tumbled through space, dodging debris and weapons fire, but her hands remained steady as she adjusted medication levels and checked breathing tubes. Their pod, along with dozens of others, streaked toward the lunar surface. Behind them, the UES Valiant split apart in a final massive explosion. Lisa felt the loss of her ship like a physical blow, but her expression never changed as she continued her work. They had survived, and her patients needed her focused on the present, not the past. The makeshift medical lab in Lunar Base Alpha was nothing like Lisa's pristine facility aboard the Valiant, but she had made it work. 3 weeks had passed since their emergency landing, and she had converted a storage room into a functional research space. The sounds of distant explosions occasionally shook dust from the ceiling, but she barely noticed anymore. Lisa sat at her microscope, studying a blood sample from a wounded Zarkak soldier who hadn't survived the crash of their fighter. Something about the cellular breakdown caught her attention. She adjusted the magnification and leaned closer. "Dr. Martinez," a voice called from the doorway. "The base is under attack again. We need to move to the emergency bunkers." "Just a moment," Lisa replied, not looking up from her work. "I think I'd found something important." She quickly took images of what she was seeing and transferred them to her tablet. The guard at the door shifted nervously as another explosion rocked the base. "Doctor, please." Commander Walsh's orders. Lisa finally looked up, her eyes bright with discovery. "Get me Commander Walsh. He needs to see this." She gestured to her screen where the cellular images were displayed. "Look at how the alien blood cells are reacting to human blood plasma. They're not just dying, they're completely breaking down." Through the security cameras watching the lab, the Zarkak's observers registered their growing unease. The human female seemed completely unconcerned with the battle raging around her. Their tactical officer noted how she continued working even as warning sirens blared and evacuation orders echoed through the base. Commander Walsh arrived shortly after, ducking instinctively as another impact shook the room. "This better be good, Doctor. We're losing ground up top." Lisa pulled up more images on her screen. The Zarkax aren't just anatomically different from us. They're fundamentally incompatible with human biology. Our blood plasma contains compounds that act like acid to their cellular structure. That's why they've been so careful to avoid physical contact during their ground assaults. She switched to another image, this one showing the progression of cellular breakdown. Their protective suits aren't just for show. They're keeping them safe from us. We're literally toxic to them. Walsh studied the images, his expression changing from confusion to understanding. "Are you saying we could use this?" Another explosion, closer this time, sent equipment rattling on the shelves. Lisa steadied her microscope before answering. "With some refinement, yes. Their biological weapons failed against us because they didn't understand human immune responses. But we could potentially develop something that would work against them." Through their surveillance, the Zarkax commanders watched in growing horror as the human calmly discussed weaponizing her discovery. Their intelligence had suggested humans were persistent, but this level of focus amid chaos was unsettling. "How long?" Walsh asked, steadying himself against a table as the base shook again. "Give me 48 hours, Lisa said, already turning back to her work. "I need to isolate the specific compounds and find a delivery method." Walsh nodded. "I'll assign a security team to protect the lab. Whatever you need, you'll have it." As Walsh left, Lisa continued her work, methodically documenting her findings. The Zarkax observers noted with growing concern that her heart rate remained steady even as parts of the base burned above her. She worked through the night, ignoring the sounds of battle and evacuation warnings, focused entirely on her task. The aliens had never encountered anything like this before, a species that could remain so collected in the face of destruction. As they watched Lisa work, they began to wonder if they had gravely underestimated their enemy. Lieutenant Chris Morgan and his special operations team arrived at Lisa's lab just as another Zarkax bombardment began. They found her carefully pipetting samples into test tubes, seemingly oblivious to the chaos above. "Dr. Martinez," Chris called out, "we're your new security detail. Commander Walsh says you're working on something that could turn this war around." Lisa nodded without looking up from her work. "I've isolated the compounds in human blood that affect the Zarkax. Now I need to make it into something we can use." She carefully placed the test tubes in a centrifuge and started it spinning. The lab shook as another explosion hit nearby. One of Chris's team members, Staff Sergeant Amy Baker, took up position near the door. "How can you work like this? Aren't you scared?" "Fear won't help my patients," Lisa replied simply, checking readings on her computer. "Or help us win this war." She moved to another station where several Petri dishes contained samples of Zarkax tissue. Through their surveillance systems, the alien commanders watched with growing unease. Their analysts had never seen such behavior in any species they had encountered. The humans' calm efficiency despite the danger was deeply unsettling. Chris set up his team at key points around the lab while Lisa continued her work. She explained her findings as she moved between experiments, her voice steady even as the sounds of battle grew closer. "The Zarkax have triple helix DNA," she said, pointing to an image on her screen. "It makes them stronger and faster than us, but it's also very fragile when exposed to certain human proteins. That's why they're so careful to avoid physical contact with us." Another blast rocked the base, closer than before. Emergency lights flashed as power fluctuated. Lisa barely paused as she adjusted her equipment to the backup power supply. "Ma'am," Chris said urgently, "we're getting reports of Zarkax ground forces breaching the upper levels. We should move to a more secure location." Lisa shook her head. "I need these specific machines. Moving would set us back days." She typed quickly on her keyboard, saving her latest results. "If you can keep them off this level for 12 more hours, I'll have something we can use." The Zarkax observers frantically reported to their superiors. The human females' continued work despite the imminent danger violated everything they understood about survival instincts. Their tactical experts began to worry about what other human behaviors they might have misunderstood. The hours passed tensely. Chris's team fought off 2 attempts by Zarkax forces to reach the lab level. Through it all, Lisa worked steadily, her movements precise and focused. She barely reacted when a stray shot punched through the ceiling, merely stepping aside as debris fell near her workstation. "I think I've got it," she announced finally, holding up a vial of pale blue liquid. "This should work as an aerosol delivery system. The protein compounds will penetrate their protective suits through any microscopic gaps." Chris radioed Commander Walsh, while Lisa prepared multiple samples of her creation. The Zarkax observers noted with alarm that her hands never shook, even as their forces pushed deeper into the base. "Doctor," Chris said quietly, "you've just changed the course of this war. How do you feel?" Lisa carefully packed the samples into a secure container. "The work isn't done yet. We still need to test it and produce more." She turned to her computer, already starting the documentation process. "Let's focus on what needs to be done next." The aliens watching through their cameras felt a chill of fear. They were beginning to understand that humanity's true strength wasn't in their weapons or technology, but in their terrifying ability to remain focused in the face of chaos. The next morning brought the heaviest Zarkax assault yet. Their ships filled the sky above Lunar Base Alpha, raining down destruction in an attempt to stop what they had seen through their surveillance. But in her underground lab, Lisa continued her work. "They're specifically targeting this section now," Chris reported, checking his tactical display. His team had grown increasingly protective of the calm doctor, who seemed unfazed by death and destruction. "They know what you're doing." Lisa nodded, carefully measuring out another batch of her biological weapon. "Then we're running out of time." She looked at the production line she had set up with help from the base's engineering team. "We need at least 50 more units before we can launch a proper counterattack." A massive explosion rocked the base, closer than ever before. Part of the ceiling collapsed at the far end of the lab, but Lisa didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted her protective mask and continued measuring compounds. Through their command ships, the Zarkax leaders watched in growing horror. They had deployed their most devastating weapons, yet the human female continued her work as if she were in a peaceful research facility. Their psychological warfare experts were baffled by her immunity to fear. "Doctor," Amy Baker called from her guard position, "they've breached level 3. That's only 2 floors above us." "Understood," Lisa replied calmly, moving to check the seals on the completed weapon canisters. "Chris, could you help me move these to the secure storage unit? We can't risk them being damaged." The alien observers became even more agitated as they watched Lisa and Chris carefully pack away the weapons. Her methodical movements and steady hands suggested not just courage, but something far more terrifying: complete focus regardless of circumstances. Another blast shook loose more ceiling panels. Emergency klaxons blared as the base's computer announced, "Warning, hull breach on level 4. Emergency containment protocols engage." Lisa paused only long enough to check that none of her equipment had been damaged. "We're still on schedule," she said, returning to her work. 20 more units to go." The Zarkax commanders frantically ordered more strikes on the lab's position. They couldn't comprehend how their best efforts at creating panic and chaos had failed so completely against this one human. Hours passed as Lisa worked steadily. Chris's team fought off 3 more attempts by Zarkax forces to reach the lab. The air grew thick with smoke and dust, but Lisa's movements never faltered. "Final batch is ready," she announced, securing the last canister. She had worked for 16 straight hours without a break, through multiple attacks and near misses. "We should move these to the launch facility now." As they prepared to transport the weapons, a direct hit rocked the lab. Chris and his team immediately moved to protect Lisa, but she was already saving her data and backing up her research notes. "Doctor," Chris said with amazement, "don't you ever get scared?" Lisa looked up from her computer, expression thoughtful. "Fear is a reaction, Chris. Focus is a choice." She finished her backup and gathered her notes. "Besides, being scared won't help us win this war." The Zarkax observers recorded her words with growing dread. They had assumed humans were simply stubborn or primitive. Now they realized they had stumbled upon something much worse, a species that could simply choose to ignore fear itself. Commander Walsh gathered Earth's remaining military leaders in the lunar base's command center. On the main screen, Lisa's weapon canisters were being loaded into missile pods. The room shook constantly from Zarkax attacks, but the hardened bunker held firm. "All units report ready," Chris announced from his position near the tactical display. His team had helped distribute the weapons to every remaining Earth defense position. "We can launch on your command." Lisa sat at a monitoring station, checking final readings on her tablet. She had insisted on being present for the first strike, wanting to observe the weapon's effectiveness firsthand. The Zarkax commanders, watching through their surveillance systems, noted with deepening unease that she looked as calm as if she were preparing for a routine experiment. "Begin countdown," Walsh ordered. "All units prepare to fire on my mark." The Earth forces had carefully coordinated their attack. Every surviving ship, station, and ground installation would launch simultaneously, giving the Zarkax no chance to adapt or escape. Lisa's weapon would blanket their entire fleet in a fine mist of human proteins. "Incoming fire," someone shouted. The bunker rocked with direct hits, but the reinforced walls held. Lisa continued checking her data, seemingly unaware of the chaos around her. "Their sensors have detected our launch preparations," Chris reported. "They're throwing everything they have at us." Walsh looked at the tactical display, watching Zarkax ships move into attack formation. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "They know what we've created." He turned to Lisa. "Doctor, any final adjustments?" She shook her head, still focused on her readings. "The formula is stable. Deploy when ready." The alien observers frantically reported her continued calm to their superiors. They had hoped the human's strange behavior was an isolated case, but now they saw the same focused determination in the faces of all the humans in the command center. "Launch in 10 seconds, the computer announced. The bunker shook with another direct hit, but no one flinched. They had learned from Lisa's example. 5 seconds. Lisa made a final note on her tablet. Launch. Hundreds of missiles streaked from Earth's remaining military positions, carrying Lisa's weapon toward the Zarkax fleet. The aliens attempted evasive maneuvers, but the coordinated strike was too widespread to dodge. Through the command center screens, they watched the missiles detonate, releasing clouds of fine mist among the alien ships. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the first distress calls began. "Their hull integrity is failing," Chris reported, watching the sensor readings. "The protein compound is eating through their ship's biological components." The Zarkax fleet began to break formation. Their ships twisted in space as their partially organic technology began to dissolve. Escape pods launched in every direction as crews abandoned their dying vessels. "It's working better than expected," Lisa noted, studying the data streaming across her screen. She began typing rapidly. "I should document these results for future refinements." The alien commanders watching through their failing systems felt their first real fear of the war. They had believed themselves superior, but they had never encountered a species that could remain so coldly efficient in the face of destruction. As their fleet crumbled around them, they finally understood that they had awakened something far more terrifying than they had imagined. Walsh watched the Zarkax ships falling into chaos. "Dr. Martinez," he said, "you've just turned the tide of this war." Lisa looked up briefly from her work. "The battle isn't over yet," she replied, returning to her documentation. "We should prepare more weapons for the next wave of attacks." 3 days after the first counterattack, Lisa stood at her familiar workstation, documenting the final results of her weapons deployment. The Zarkax fleet had retreated beyond Mars orbit. their mighty armada reduced to less than half its original size. "Doctor," Chris said, entering the lab with Commander Walsh, "we've just received the last reconnaissance reports. The Zarkaks are abandoning their remaining outposts in the solar system." Lisa nodded, still typing her notes. Around her, the lab was being rebuilt, though occasional tremors still shook dust from the hastily repaired ceiling. "Have we analyzed the debris from their destroyed ships?" she asked. "The biological components might give us insights into their other weaknesses." The few remaining Zarkaks observation devices captured her continued focus with a mixture of fear and awe. Even in victory, the human female maintained her methodical approach, treating their species' greatest military defeat as simply another scientific study to be documented. "The refugee ships we captured are revealing a lot about their civilization," Walsh reported. "Their leaders have sent a formal surrender request. They're terrified we might have more weapons like yours." For the first time in days, Lisa looked up from her work. "They should be more worried about what we learned from this encounter," she said. "Their biological technology is fascinating. I've already identified several potential medical applications." Through their monitors, the alien observers shuddered. They had hoped the humans' frightening focus would diminish once the immediate threat passed. Instead, she was already looking for ways to adapt their technology for her own purposes. "The war's over, Doctor," Chris said gently. "You can rest now." Lisa gave him a small smile. "Science doesn't rest, Chris. Besides, I need to complete these reports for future reference. We should be prepared in case they return." The Zarkaks commanders watching the feed quickly noted her words in their retreat reports. They had already decided to mark Earth's solar system as permanently forbidden for colonization, but now they added urgent warnings about humanity's persistent nature. Walsh stepped forward, holding an official-looking document. "Speaking of reports, Earth Command has sent your commendation. They're naming you head of the new Xenobiology Defense Division." "That's nice," Lisa replied absently, already back to her work. "Please tell them I'll need a larger lab and access to all the captured Zarkaks biotechnology." Chris and Walsh exchanged knowing looks. The woman who had saved humanity by simply refusing to stop working hadn't changed at all. To her, the alien invasion had been a problem to solve, nothing more. The last Zarkaks surveillance system recorded her final actions before failing. In their archives, they marked the footage with their highest warning level. Humans, species capable of maintaining complete focus through conditions that would break any rational being. Extreme caution advised. As Lisa finished her reports that evening, she paused briefly to watch Earth rising over the lunar horizon through her lab window. The planet's orbital defense platforms were already being rebuilt, stronger than before. She made a note to study the Zarkaks shield technology next week. "Time to start the next project," she said to herself, opening a new file on her computer. Behind her, the last alien monitoring device clicked off, its operators having seen enough. They had come expecting to find a primitive species. Instead, they had discovered something far more dangerous, a humanity that simply refused to be distracted from its goals, no matter the chaos around them. Lisa Martinez turned back to her work, already focusing on humanity's next challenge. After all, there would always be more to learn, more to discover, more to protect. The stars awaited, and she had research to do.